I rise today to speak to the bill which I have introduced into this place, the Regional Forest Agreements Legislation Repeal Bill 2017. This bill seeks to end the destruction of Australia's native forests by repealing the Act which enables logging to continue with exemptions, continue without the oversight from our country's environmental protection laws. These logging laws, the regional forest agreements, are outdated, they are destructive, and they are not achieving the environmental or economic purposes for which they are intended. And for me, this is a question of justice across generations. I challenge all of us in this place to consider how we will feel if we can't offer our children and our grandchildren the same experiences in the natural world that we have experienced. If they can't enjoy camping by a crystal clear river, fringed by magnificent forest, camping at night around a campfire, listening to the sounds of the night, listening to the booboks, the mopokes, listening to the owls, listening to the screeching of gliding possums. If our children and grandchildren can't marvel at birds like swift parrots and be amazed by creatures like the giant freshwater lobster of northwest Tasmania, can't be inspired by gorgeous creatures like the leadbeater's possums, if our children and grandchildren don't have those experiences, they don't know those animals, those precious animals and birds, because their homes, their nesting sites, their food supplies have been destroyed. And beyond experiencing magnificent forests, what if they can't ski on our alpine slopes deprived of snow, can't snorkel a reef on Queensland coast filled with colourful coral? Logging has wide-reaching impacts, contributing to the further warming of our planet. So it's not just the immediate destruction of areas of forest, and destruction it is, intensive industrial-scale clear-fell logging. It's not just the destruction that wreaks on our forests, it's the impact that those forests are then no longer there to be soaking up carbon, to be playing their bit, a critical role of tackling dangerous climate change. I remember very well the first time I saw a clear-fell forest. I was 23 years old. I'd just finished university, working out what I wanted to do for the rest of my life, and I visited some forest in East Gippsland that had been clear-felled, then been burnt, totally destroyed. And for me, it was this awareness of why is this happening? And so I did a bit more research and discovered the justification for it was to be producing timber that was largely, even then, only going to very low-value purposes. It was being used for housing construction timber, which even then, 30 years ago, we had plantation pine that was going to take up that market. It was being used for tomato stakes. It was being used for pallets. And I asked myself, we are causing all of this destruction for such little ends. And as a rational person, though, I said, oh yes, but we need timber, we need wood, so surely we must need to be doing this. And I did a bit more research and found out that no, we didn't, that virtually all of the wood that was coming from this incredible natural heritage, this precious natural heritage that we have here in Australia, all of the purposes that timber was being put to, we could be getting supplies from other much less precious places. Certainly not the old-growth forest that was being logged then that is still being logged now. I did the research then, and the research has continued in the last 30 years to show that the wood, this forest destruction that's occurring, isn't occurring because we need the timber. It's not occurring because we need the jobs. It's occurring just because of this, well, we've got forests there, so we've got to do something with them. We can be getting, and increasingly we are getting, much a much greater proportion of our timber and wood product supplies from sustainable plantations. That's the direction of the industry for the future. And yet, the regional forest agreements that this government is rolling over is pretending that we are right back where we were last century, not acknowledging that we can be protecting our forests and maintaining a viable wood products industry. Let me lay out what this bill seeks to achieve, with the principle in mind that our precious places should be properly managed for all of the values they hold, including their value to our future generations. For the past 2 decades, our native forests have been managed under the banner of these 10 regional forest agreements, or RFAs, which were established between the federal government and the states. And these agreements cover significant tracts, all of the potentially economically so-called productive forests in Victoria, Tasmania, Western Australia and New South Wales. This bill would wind up each of the 10 regional forest agreements at the time of their expiry dates. I note that the Tasmanian Regional Forest Agreement has been subject to a variation which was signed on the 18th of August last year by the Prime Minister and the Tasmanian Premier. And this was presented to the public as a variation, but the actual outcome is a substantial rewriting of the RFA, which was undertaken without any engagement of this parliament, despite the significance of the extension of this RFA to 2037, and that in effect it makes future extensions automatic into perpetuity. This is staggering. When the RFAs were introduced 20 years ago, they were meant to provide long-term sustainable forest management to protect these complex ecosystems and to ensure the viability of threatened species living in the forests, as well as govern the production of timber from these forests and maintain jobs. They have failed in every regard. And the government has indicated that, like they've done with the Tasmanian Agreement, they intend to just roll over the existing 20-year regional forest agreements when they come up for expiry. The lack of rigour and reflection in this position is astounding, and it demonstrates that the government does not have any commitment to safeguarding our carbon stores, our clean water, our water supplies, our tourism hotspots and wildlife habitat, nor the current and future jobs of locals who rely on all of these. Across Australia, the evidence of the last 20 years is that the regional forest agreements have failed, and they continue to fail in their goals of providing security to industry and workers and to secure a reserve system to protect species. When then Prime Minister John Howard and the Victorian Premier signed the Victorian Central Highlands Regional Forest Agreement in 1998, the Howard Government Environment Minister stated that the RFA would ensure that the whole forest would be sustainably managed for future generations. And yet, under the regional forest agreements, these forests are logged, pulped and burnt. And the story is exactly the same across the other 9 areas subject to RFAs. Yes, under the regional forest agreements there were some areas of forests that were reserved, but there were vast areas of forests of equal value, of equal significance, that have not been protected, that have been subject to ongoing intensive logging in the 20 years since. The regional forest agreements are outdated, impotent and costing us irrecoverable species, taxpayer dollars and extensive foregone opportunities. We need to scrap them. As I've already said, over 80% of the timber, the wood products that are being produced in Australia are now being produced from plantations. The remaining native forest timber industry is just the rump of the timber industry, and it's not the direction that the industry is headed in. It's not where all of the excitement of, say, having timber for multi-storey buildings is coming from. No, that's coming from timber that's coming from plantations. When you look at the latest announcement of a new sawmill, the Hermal Mill in northwest Tasmania, that is going to be a plantation-based hardwood plantation-based sawmill. This is the direction that we need to be just continuing and transitioning all of the industry out of our native forest, so we can have that sustainable plantation-based industry, and we can be protecting our precious native forests for the so many values that they also hold. One of the most appalling parts of the Regional Forest Agreement, of our current logging laws, is that they exempt logging from our national environment protection laws. When an area is logged under an RFA, it's deemed to be occurring in an environmentally sustainable, ecologically sustainable way, even where there is ample evidence that this is not the case. There are no grounds for our environment protection laws, the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, to apply. Think of that. These complex native forest ecosystems are not protected through our national environment protection laws from the destruction of logging. This means that even if a critically endangered species is found in a forest valley or ridge, under an RFA, it's still okay to go ahead with the logging. All that needs to happen with regard to any endangered species is that there needs to be a recovery plan in place. Or not even in place, a recovery plan being planned. It doesn't matter whether this recovery plan at the end of the day is shown to have been totally inadequate to protect the species. All that's required is, well, get a recovery plan in place, and then logging can continue to occur under the rules that are set out in the recovery plan. And in fact, they're not even rules. The recovery plan actually is only guidelines for how logging could occur. So there is no rigour, there is no ability for the EPBC Act to overrule the logging operations occurring under an RFA, even where the evidence is there, as it is that you have got threatened species that are being driven towards extinction by those logging operations. And how can it be possible that native forest gets this special treatment? Other extractive industries, such as mining, are required to justify their impact on the environment, but not the native forest industry. They get to carve out sections of precious forest to destroy them. They're given carte blanche to destroy animals, plants and vital habitat. Let me remind the chamber that the Commonwealth has a duty to protect our environment for all Australians, yet in continuing the regional forest agreements and their exemption from the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, this government is shirking that responsibility and is allowing an extractive industry, because that's what it is, it's an extractive industry, to carry out its business with no regard for the long-term damage this does to our forests. For all talk of, the forest will regrow, when you are logging a forest that has got trees in it that are hundreds of years old, that's such as the logging that's currently occurring in East Gippsland, such as the logging that's currently occurring in Tasmania, you cannot say that we are replacing this forest, because you cannot replace an old-growth, unlogged forest, a complex, ancient forest, with essentially just a plantation of young species that will not provide the habitat for those plants and animals for hundreds and hundreds of years, and certainly won't provide the nesting hollows in those trees for the species that rely on them, that need the hollows in old trees in order to be able to survive. It is an extractive industry. It is just destroying that forest in terms of its value for those precious and threatened animals. And as a nation, we have the worst rate of mammal extinctions in the world over the last 200 years since colonisation, and we have forest-dependent species that are headed to add to those extinctions. The critically endangered leadbeater's possum, the critically endangered swift parrots, the giant freshwater crayfish, the Carnaby's cockatoo. These animals are threatened and are becoming more threatened, and yet logging is allowed to continue to occur in places where they occur. It's a shameful position to be in. Shameful, particularly as a wealthy, developed nation, particularly as a nation with so many unique species that are found nowhere else in the world, and particularly as a nation that we've only seen just over 200 years of this atrocious use of our land. Just over 200 years. The forests, such as at Granite Mountain in East Gippsland, with trees hundreds of years old, those trees were old when Captain Cook sailed past just over 200 years ago. These extinctions are not a trend we want to continue, particularly with our unique plants and animals serving as a backbone for our incredibly valuable tourism industry and the many thousands of families and communities whose livelihood relies on the protection of these precious places. And the sheer enormity of past extinction rates and the tiny amount of pristine native habitats remaining in Australia means we need to fight to conserve every remaining piece. In my home state of Victoria, I've already mentioned the leadbeater's possum. It's critically endangered. Their primary habitat, the beautiful mountain ash forests, are in such dire condition that the whole ecosystem, the animals and the ecosystem, are listed as being critically endangered. We've got a government that is saying, oh, but the leadbeater's possum, they're having a massive population increase, which is based on absolutely farcical data. If you look at the most thorough review of the science with leadbeater's possums, it shows that they are in dire straits. Yes, we may have observed more leadbeater's possums over the last year because there have been more people out looking for them. It does not mean that those populations have increased. The forests of the planned Great Koala Park in New South Wales, the Great Forest National Park in Victoria, the Tarkine in Tasmania, West Australia's southwest forests, and the incredibly biodiverse and beautiful East Gippsland are hugely valuable parts of our natural heritage and must remain so for future generations. A recent assessment of Victoria's Central Highlands forests using ecosystem accounting methodology, which was published in the prestigious journal Nature, Ecology and Evolution, it clearly demonstrated that there are considerably greater benefits from carbon soaking up and storing carbon, water, habitat provision and recreational amenity if logging ceased, compared with the economic value of logging these forests. And this work also clearly shows that the economic benefits of native forest logging are small compared to other industries in the region, and the economic impact of ceasing native forest logging could be more than offset by increases in other industries such as tourism and by entering the carbon market. Now, native forest areas have got enormous tourism potential, which is undermined by destructive and unsightly logging practices. And the people and small businesses of regional Australia would stand to benefit hugely from increasing the amount of forest being protected and stronger government plans promoting tourism and recreation over logging. Jobs are vital in the regional communities living near and in our forest areas, and we need to face up to the reality that direct employment in the forestry industry is already drying up. It's been drying up for the last 20 years due to its economic and environmental unsustainability. And many mills are just scraping through on direct and indirect taxpayer subsidies, with the Victorian government paying $50 million to buy the Hayfield mill. We know that logging in East Gippsland costs us, the taxpayers, $5 million a year. It costs us for the logging of our forests. Just think about what else that money could be spent on. Think about if you spent $5 million a year or more than that on improving the tourism infrastructure, the recreation infrastructure, walking tracks, upgrading forest drives, upgrading bicycle touring tracks. There's many, many more jobs in really valuing the forests as a tourism resource than the ongoing logging. Industrial logging in our public native forests has had its day. It's failed to protect our environment and it's failed to protect jobs. The future for the Australian wood products industry is in a sustainably managed plantation industry. So in order to achieve this vision for long-term sustainability for Australian wood products industry and to protect our native forests with all their unparalleled values, we must scrap the regional forest agreements. This bill to repeal the RFAs does what the government has failed to do. This bill would protect our forests in a way that all Australians now and into the future would value and really appreciate well into the future.